Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 5-Minute Life Changer podcast. This is Robert Landau, podcast host, motivational speaker, and certified life coach that works with people the world over via Zoom. I am so glad you decided to join me for this episode. There probably won't be many of you that will decide to join me for this episode. I'm very curious to see over time how many downloads of this particular episode there will be compared to the downloads of other episodes in this podcast series. Why would I say that? Well, typically, particularly in Western cultures, death is not a very popular topic. I do over 20 different motivational and inspirational seminars for the corporate world and for groups and organizations, so on and so forth. However, I do one in the list of seminars that I do on the fear of death. And that's the one that's booked the least. Why? Because it's not happy, because it's not celebratory, it's not up. People consider that topic, the topic of death and the fear of it, to be down. Do I hope to change that in this episode? Well, you be the judge of that. Maybe just a little bit. We'll see. So many of you know that I was an international cruise director for just under 10 years, 300 ports of call on close to 400 cruises, and many of those ports of call were visits to indigenous cultures that are still in touch with their heritage, and their view of death and dying and fear of death is so different than our view of all of that in Western culture. Many of the places that I visited, remote places, island nations, they celebrate when somebody's about to pass or transit because those cultures know. They know, maybe not you, maybe not many in Western cultures, that there is something after life. Back in the late 1970s, when I was an actor in New York City, I began to feel that we weren't being told the whole story about many things. And it sent me on a wonderful path of discovery, of learning, of researching things that I wanted to know more about. And the topic of death is, not was, but still is one of them. My first brush with the energy of death was back in I think it was like the late 1960s, when my father's father passed. And my father was very close to his father, so it really hit my father hard. And my father was a very upbeat, amazingly positive, energetic guy. And for the first time in my life, when my grandfather passed, my father would close the doors of his study in the house where my brother and I were raised, and he would sit there for about 3 nights in the darkness alone. And that really registered to me. That my father, although not saying anything to my brother and I about it, I'm sure he said that to my mother, was in deep despair. And I thought, wow, so that's death, huh? And that's the effect that death has on people. My next contact with death was when I was a cruise director on a wonderful ship called the World Discoverer. All that ship did was visit remote, out-of-the-way places in the South Pacific, Asia. It was an amazing ship to cruise direct on. We had a Filipino crew. And one day, my phone rang at about 5:30 in the morning in my stateroom on the ship, and it was the captain. And he said, "Robert, I don't know how to tell you this, but a crew member overnight had a heart attack and passed. And he is in the medical office now, gone." And we would like you, since you also as cruise director do the interfaith Christian service on board, we want you to do a little service and say a blessing over his body. And I said, "Of course, Captain. So let me get this straight. His body is in the medical office, and you want me to do a service there with his body in the room." And he said, yes, please. Thank you. And I thought, wow, now this is going to be interesting because I had never seen a dead body before. So I went in about 15 minutes before the service was to begin, and it was just me and this wonderful guy who had passed, stretched out. He was laying on a surgeon's table. And I just looked at his face, and he was so at peace. It was just actually beautiful to witness. And so the crew came in, the officers came in, I did the service, and I thought, wow, how is it that he had a heart attack overnight, but he has such a peaceful expression on his face? And that got me to thinking. The next brush with death I want to tell you about very briefly was when my parents passed. My father was a very famous symphony orchestra conductor, and they lived, my mother and father, the last years of their lives in upstate New York, very close to the Canadian border near Montreal. Beautiful Victorian house in the middle of nowhere, and one night the house caught fire and burned to the ground with my parents in it. It was a devastating loss to me. I was very close, still am, to my parents. That was back in 2007. I'm here to tell you that grieving never ends, but it does get better with time. It's all in how you choose to treat yourself during that process. So, death. I started to research death even more once my parents passed. I don't know if this is of interest to you, but it certainly is to me. There are thousands of people all the time having something called near-death experiences, NDEs. Do a search for that on YouTube, and you will hear some of the most amazing people talk about their experience, having been pronounced dead for whatever reason. They were in an accident and they were pronounced dead, but then they came back to life, or people who were in a coma for 3 days, a week, 2 weeks, and then they came back to life. And all of these people who have had near-death experiences, most of them tell the same story. They went to a place that was filled with light. All of the relatives and friends and pets that had passed before, they were there to greet them. Deities were there. Christ was there. An angel was there. The stories differ slightly, but it's always the same thing in that there's a good possibility that this is not all there is. To me, it would be a colossal joke if our lives, seeming to be just 2 minutes long, are over one day, and that's it. There has to be more, and I want you to consider that too. Here's a little bit of proof that I got. 2 weeks after my parents passed, I had this quote-unquote dream, and my mother came to me, and she was in the driveway of the house where we were raised in Westchester, New York. And she didn't see me. I was standing in the driveway, and she was walking across the driveway, very determined to get to wherever she was going. And I said, "Mom!" And she stopped, and she turned and looked at me, and she goes, "Oh, hello." And I said, "Mom, are you okay?" And she smiled at me, and she nodded, and she said, "Yes, I am." And then she turned in the direction where she was going to and walked off. So I don't believe that was a dream. I think somewhere else that really happened. And it was her way of telling me that she's continuing her journey and that her physical body may not be anymore, but her soul, her true energy, her being, her light, continues on forever. That gives me hope. So do a little research, a little positive, not negative research on the topic of death. Fear stands for future events appearing real. You can make your fear of death much worse than it really needs to be. Just understand that it's a part of life and that all of this might not be over when it's your time to transit. I don't even call it to die. I say transit because it's just a shift in form. This may sound bizarre to a lot of you, but here's what I believe. You don't have to. But consider the possibility that there's more to us than our physical bodies. That there's a being that's light filled, that's a part of your soul, that never dies, that is eternal. It just comes back to places like this to continue to learn. Yes, it's okay to fear death, but understand that it might really end up being something amazing than something horrid. I know we went over our established time. Sometimes I have to admit it's difficult for me to keep in the 5-minute format, but I hope you don't mind. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this, a very important episode. Researching the fear of death is an ongoing topic that should never end. But the fear can get better with time. I know it has for me, as I hope it will for you. This has been Robert Landau with the 5-Minute Life Changer podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, if you resonated with it, please give the video a like. And also, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can stay up to date with all the motivation I will continue to share with you. Thank you.